The second cause of Japanese expansionism is militarism and foreign policy. As I've stated before, Japan had a long history of militarism. The pre-modern government of Japan had been really a military dictatorship under the rule of a shogun. The emperor was simply a symbol of national unity and really had no power at all. Industrialization, including factories, railroads, ports, and international trade, strengthened Japan and as a result the position of the emperor. So we see this foreign policy is actually going to lead to its expansion as it begins to take over neighboring states and territories. Japan had long had economic and political interests in Korea, the closest neighboring state. The Mongol Empire launched attacks against Japan in the years 1274 and 1281 unsuccessfully. Japan invaded Korea in the late 16th century but was forced out by Korean and Chinese armies. By 1876, Japan had enough Western military technology and a new desire to export its manufactured goods that it was able to force Korea to sign the Japan-Korea Treaty, also known as the Japan-Korea Treaty of Amity. This document stated that Korea was no longer a tributary state to China. Japanese citizens could not be arrested or tried in Korean courts. Korea could not impose any restrictions on Japanese trade, and Japan was allowed the use of 3 ports for its exports. In 1884, supporters of Japan overthrew Korea's government briefly in a coup d'etat. A counter-coup was launched against this new government and supported by Chinese troops. It was clear to other states that Korea was unable to defend itself from other countries, and in 1885, Britain took control of a Korean port city. In 1894, a major peasant revolt erupted against the Korean government, partly in response to the presence of Japan in the country's affairs. When the Korean government asked China for assistance, Japan declared that Korea had violated the Japan-Korean Treaty and occupied the capital city with 8,000 troops. It installed a government and assassinated its main opposition leader, Empress Myeong-soon, in 1895. Japanese interference in Korean affairs led to war with China. A long series of events, primarily over Japan's interference in Korean affairs, but also including assassinations, bans on Japanese imports in China, and other issues, caused increasing tensions between Japan and the Qing dynasty of China. Japan's essential takeover of Korea in 1894 and the gain of even more rights there caused the Qing dynasty to declare war on Japan in August 1894. The war progressed rapidly for Japan, which had a modernized military, complete with ironclad warships, floating bridges, and modern rifles. By October, Chinese troops had been driven out of Korea, and Japan began the invasion of Manchuria, a huge province in northeastern China and the ancestral homeland of the Qing emperors of China. Several towns and cities were captured by Japanese troops before winter weather slowed their invasion. In November, Japanese forces captured Port Arthur, a major economic prize. By mid-February 1895, after a long siege, they seized the port of Weihai Wei. Then in March, they captured islands off of Taiwan. China requested Japan's terms for peace after suffering nothing but defeat after defeat. So, as a result, they negotiated the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This was China requested Japan's terms for peace after suffering nothing but defeat. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed by both countries in April 1895. This treaty granted Korea full independence from China, gave Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, required China to pay a large indemnity to Japan, approximately 13,000 tons of silver. It also allowed Japanese ships to operate on the Yangtze River and to have factories in 4 Chinese ports that would now be completely open to Japanese imports. Immediately after the treaty was announced, Russia, Germany, and France declared that the treaty had to be altered to accommodate their desires. Although Japan clearly dominated China during the war, it was in no way prepared to deal with the 3 of the world's great military powers. In this tripartite intervention, as it became known, Russia took control of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, leasing them from China. Germany would soon take control of part of the Shantung Peninsula from the much weakened Chinese government. Japan was humiliated and embittered, but forced to submit to the European powers' demands. Although the Chinese government gave Taiwan to Japan, officials in Taiwan resisted. On the 23rd of May, 1895, Taiwan declared itself the Republic of Formosa, leading to a 5-month war that ended with a Japanese victory in October. Russian control of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur in 1895 had revealed that Japan needed more development if it was to protect itself and its interests from European states. Japan's industrialization continued at a rapid rate, leading to increasing exports, increasing revenues to support further military costs, and a larger, better armed military. Japan also sought allies. Britain was also concerned with Russian expansionism in Asia. Russia was rapidly industrializing, clearly expanding towards China, and had gained the major port of Port Arthur, and was now building a railway to link the entire Russian Empire with its Asian possessions. Britain had dominated China economically through wars, lopsided treaties throughout the 19th century. It had no intention of allowing Russia to expand without a challenge. Unable to afford the expense of a large naval fleet or standing army in China, Britain formed the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 with Japan. It was the first military alliance for Japan in modern times. Essentially, it said Japan and Britain would aid each other mutually if either was at war with 2 or more countries. If either country was at war with only one other state, then the other would remain neutral. This alliance was clearly directed at Russia, and Russia's only ally was France. France had no intention of fighting a distant war in Asia, since it was more concerned with an increasingly aggressive Germany. The alliance guaranteed Japan that it needed to deal only with Russia in the case of war, and it was determined to provoke a war and win. Tensions between Russia and Japan had increased between 1895 and 1904. Russia leasing Port Arthur and the parts of the Liaodong Peninsula from China stationed a fleet of warships off Port Arthur in December of 1897. The port was soon fortified and construction started on railways that would eventually link it to Russia through China's Manchuria. Russia began to pressure Korea to grant mining and forestry rights, further provoking Japan, which felt that Korea was in its sphere of influence. During the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1899 and 1900, approximately 200,000 Russian troops were stationed in Manchuria to protect the railway from Chinese rebels and soldiers. This was also done to prevent Japan from stationing troops there and interfering with Russia's interests in the region. Once the Boxer Rebellion had been crushed, these troops were not withdrawn despite Russia's promises to do so. Both Britain and Japan felt that their interests in China and Korea were threatened by this force. At first, Japan initiated a series of diplomatic meetings with Russia to resolve the crisis and to clarify the sphere of influence of each state. Korea and China were too weak for either power to consider their input or protest. Eventually, Japan proposed that Manchuria would be in the Russian sphere of influence and Korea would be in Japan's. Russia did not respond, and so in February 1904, Japan expelled Russia's ambassador and severed all relations with Russia. Many historians believe that Russia's government desired war with Japan due to a crippling political crisis in Russia at the time, in which there were calls for a constitution and governing reforms, which were opposed to the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas II's government hoped that an outpouring of nationalism at Russia's eventual victory over Japan would reinforce the Tsar's popularity and help suppress criticism of his government and its institutions. Japan attacked the Russian Navy at Port Arthur on February 1904 and soon afterwards launched an invasion of Korea. By the end of April, a Japanese army had entered Russian-controlled Manchuria. The Japanese Navy had defeated the Port Arthur-based Russian Navy, and now Port Arthur was under siege by land and sea. In December, Japanese artillery destroyed most of Russia's navy that was anchored at Port Arthur. The city itself surrendered in January 1905. A Russian army hoping to relieve the siege had been forced to retreat to the city of Mukden in Manchuria, ending all hopes of saving the port city. Mukden fell to Japan in March after a massive battle involving around 500,000 soldiers, one of the largest battles of the 20th century. Russia's European-based navy finally arrived in May 1905 after months at sea, only to be annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima Straits. Japan then occupied islands and the Russian Pacific Ocean coast. A revolution erupted in Russia against its government, and Russia sued for peace. Russia and Japan signed the Treaty of Portsmouth that brought the Russo-Japanese War to a close. This was negotiated by the United States. The treaty required both Russia and Japan to remove all troops from Manchuria and restore it to China's control. It allowed Japan to lease the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur from China. It granted Japan the right to lease the Russian-built Southern Manchurian Railroad from China, and it granted Japan the southern half of the Sakhalin Islands. Japan acquired international respect and authority as the result of the Russo-Japanese War. In addition to the treaty's benefits, the USA agreed to Japanese control over Korea in return for Japan allowing the US full dominance of the Philippines, its large Asian colony. Britain extended the Anglo-Japanese alliance and recognized Japan's control over Korea as legitimate. The Japanese military's prestige soared, and it benefited from increased government spending. Nevertheless, Japan believed that it should have received an indemnity from Russia to pay for the war, all of the islands under dispute, and outright control of Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula, and parts of Manchuria instead of having to lease them from China. The First World War erupted in 1914 and allowed Japan an opportunity to demonstrate its strength. This strength was directed at Germany and China, although China was essentially an ally of Japan during the war. Britain requested Japan's assistance in August of 1914 in line with their earlier treaty. Germany had leased a part of the Xiantong Peninsula from China in 1898 and soon built a fortified harbor at Tsingtao. Germany kept several naval warships there, but removed them when it was clear that Japan would move against the port. Tsingtao surrendered in November of 1914 after a 2-month naval blockade and a month-long siege. During this period, Japan took control of various German colonies in the Pacific, including Palau and the archipelagos of the Marianas and the Marshalls and the Carolines. While Europe was occupied with war in Europe, Japan presented a document known as the 21 Demands to China in January 1915. Among the various demands, Japan insisted that China cease losing territory to foreign countries other than Japan, that they agree to Japanese control of the Xiantong Peninsula and Manchuria, allow Japanese advisors to work with various Chinese government officials on its policies, agree to Japan building railways connecting various ports and areas under its control, extend Japanese lease on the South Manchurian Railway, and allow Japanese citizens to purchase and lease land for economic and agricultural purposes in Manchuria and other northern regions. They also asked that China allow Japanese citizens to enter and travel freely within Manchuria without any interference from China. They had to agree to Japan opening mines in Manchuria, allow Japan to construct its own hospitals, schools, and temples anywhere in China, and purchase any needed military equipment from Japan, where all military training must now come. China delayed responding to the 21 demands until May of 1915, mostly because they were outrageous. When Japan threatened war unless China agreed, they finally did answer. Japan eventually modified the document, reducing the demands to 13. China, in no position to resist Japan in the case of war, gave in. Anti-Japanese and anti-government riots erupted across the country, the first of many. The USA and Britain, both allies of Japan, were now concerned about Japan's aggression towards China and worked to limit Japan's control over it at the Paris Peace Conference. Japan was one of the victorious powers that determined the nature of the world's peace after the First World War. Japan, like other participating states, was primarily concerned with its own interests. During the conference, the League of Nations was formed, and Japan was a founding member. Members of the League agreed to the concept of collective security. This meant that a war with one member of the League was a war against all members of the League. League members agreed to settle all disputes through negotiation and arbitration. When the concept of the League of Nations was presented and various ideas were debated, Japan and other non-European countries demanded a clause against racial discrimination. Japan knew that European countries considered them racially inferior, and so as a result, they thought that because they were not European, they were at a disadvantage. China agreed with Japan and also demanded this clause. In the end, other freedoms and rights were included in the document, such as that of religion, but the USA insisted that any statement mentioning racial equality could not be included. There was racial segregation and other forms of discrimination in the US and most European empires at the time, so these powerful states were not interested in addressing this issue. Japan wanted to keep the Xiantong Peninsula and Germany's former island empire in the Pacific. A system of League of Nations mandates were created to govern former territories and colonies of the defeated states of the First World War. Japan was granted supervision but not outright annexation of the Mandate of the South Pacific, which was Germany's islands. The Shantung Peninsula created a problem since Japan occupied the region and China had agreed to allow Japan to control it. Now, however, China demanded its return, and the US clearly wanted it to be a part of China to limit Japan's ambitions in the region. In a system of compromises, Japan was able to retain the Shantung Peninsula, but this lasted for only a few years. Despite not being able to achieve all its demands in Paris, Japan was now clearly an important military power. In a few short years, Russia had been defeated, Korea had been annexed, important ports in China, plus neighboring territories, had been leased, German forces had been defeated, and Japan now sat with the most powerful nations determining the world's future. To secure these acquisitions and power and obtain more, Japan instituted conscription and increased the size of its navy. Japan was one of two most powerful states in the Pacific Ocean region. The other was the United States. Both countries worked diplomatically to limit each other's military strength. Japan wanted security initially and later empire, as well as unrestricted access to US markets and products, especially oil and metals. The US had no desire for an expensive war in Asia, but also wanted security for its main colony, the Philippines, and other territories such as Hawaii and Guam. The USA wanted unfettered access to China's markets as well. Meanwhile, Japan's government worked to not provoke the United States, as any economic response would devastate its economy. Yet Japan was also involved in China, a politically unstable state, and with many investments in military units to protect them. Lastly, it bears mentioning the importance of Manchuria to China. China was a rocky island. Really, it was scattered. They didn't have a lot of food production, nor was it a mineral-rich area. So as a result, if they were going to fuel their military, they needed resources. The closest area that was featuring instability was Manchuria. And it was agriculturally and mineral rich, and it could serve as a buffer against Russian aggression up until 1904. And then it really served as an area, as an extension of Japan, a very fertile extension of Japan. In conclusion, you have a bunch of early foreign policy successes. You have the tripartite intervention of 1895, the Treaty of Portsmouth of 1905, and the Shantung Peninsula of 1922. You also see Japan involved in Washington and London naval conferences, and during their interwar foreign policy contradicted the desires of the military to grow and expand the state. You get a series of national humiliations according to military and their supporters, and this led to growing militarism and increased military spending and growing radical nationalism. There were several military successes that also fed this growing radical nationalism. You had the successful invasion of Korea from 1894 to 1905, the victory in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895, the success of the Russo-Japanese War, and then their rise to a global power in the First World War. So all of this sets Japan up to radically increase their military spending and become quite aggressive. Next, we will look at our third cause of Japanese expansionism, which is economic and political issues.